Over the last few decades, investigators interviewed the sole survivors of hundreds of deadly accidents. Most of those interviews were exactly what you'd expect. People described twisted metal, screaming, smoke, fire, the moment everything went black. But hidden among those case files was a detail so strange that almost everyone ignored it. Because a handful of survivors, people from different countries, different cultures, and different decades, described the exact same figure. None of them knew each other. None of them had ever heard the other interviews. Yet many of them remembered the same impossible thing. One of the earliest recorded cases came after a devastating highway collision in the late 1990s. Just before midnight, a truck crossed into oncoming traffic. The crash killed 5 people instantly. Only one survived. Days later, during a routine psychological evaluation, the survivor was asked a simple question. What is the last thing you remember before losing consciousness? The answer wasn't about the truck. It wasn't about the impact. Instead, the survivor frowned, looked down at the floor, and quietly said, "I thought it was another person. He was standing beside the road. I remember wondering why he wasn't moving. The psychologist assumed it was nothing more than trauma-induced memory distortion." The statement was documented. The interview ended. The file was archived. And for years, nobody ever looked at it again. Nearly a decade later, a fishing boat disappeared during a violent storm. Search teams spent 2 days recovering bodies. There was only one survivor. When the interview reached its final questions, investigators asked whether anything unusual stood out before the accident. The survivor didn't answer immediately. He sat in silence, then finally said, "There was someone watching us. He wasn't on the boat. I don't know where he was, but I could see him." Just like the previous case, nobody considered the answer important. People who survive catastrophic events often experience fragmented memories. Hallucinations aren't uncommon. The interview was filed away. Nothing connected it to the highway collision. There was no reason to. Different country, different language, different investigators, different victims. Years passed. Another disaster. This time, a passenger train derailed shortly after leaving a tunnel. The accident left dozens dead. Only one passenger survived. Near the end of the interview, the investigator asked the same routine question. "Do you remember anything unusual?" The survivor hesitated, then looked directly at the investigator. "You're going to think I'm insane. Just tell me what you remember." There was someone outside. He was too tall. I couldn't make out his face, but I remember thinking, why is he just standing there? Once again, the answer was dismissed as psychological trauma. The file was closed. Nobody compared it to the previous interviews, because nobody knew there was anything to compare. Over the following years, similar interviews quietly accumulated. A factory explosion, a mountain rescue, an elevator collapse, a bridge disaster. Most survivors remembered nothing unusual. Some remembered nothing at all. But every so often, one person would describe someone standing nearby, never speaking, never running, never reacting, just watching. On their own, the interviews meant nothing. Together, they raised a question nobody had ever thought to ask. What if these people weren't remembering different hallucinations? What if they were remembering the same one? At first, the similarities didn't seem important. Psychologists believed trauma could produce distorted memories. Investigators focused on evidence, not unexplained statements. And with every accident happening years apart, in different countries, there was simply no reason to compare the interviews. So nobody did. Until one researcher accidentally came across them. It wasn't part of a paranormal investigation. He wasn't looking for monsters. He was studying survivor testimony, trying to understand how traumatic experiences affected human memory. While reviewing archived interviews, he noticed something unusual. Certain descriptions felt familiar, not identical, just strangely familiar. He requested more case files, then more, then even more. The more interviews he read, the harder it became to ignore the pattern. The wording was always different. One survivor called it a tall man. Another described a shadow that looked human. Someone else simply wrote, "I don't know what it was." No two descriptions matched perfectly, but they all shared the same unsettling details. Extremely tall, standing still, watching. None of the survivors claimed the figure attacked them. None said it spoke. None believed it caused the accident. It was simply there, watching. The researcher initially assumed the cases had somehow influenced one another. Maybe one interview had been published. Maybe journalists had repeated certain details. Maybe the stories had spread online. But the dates didn't fit. Several interviews had been recorded before the internet became widely accessible. Others had never been released outside official archives. Some came from countries thousands of miles apart. Many survivors didn't even speak the same language. The possibility of collaboration slowly disappeared. Then he noticed something even stranger. In several interviews, survivors had been asked to sketch anything unusual they remembered. Most declined. Some drew random shapes. A few refused entirely. But several agreed. The drawings had been forgotten inside their case files for years. No one had compared them. No one had placed them side by side. Until now. The researcher spread the sketches across his desk. The first drawing showed an impossibly tall figure standing at the edge of a road. The second placed a similar silhouette near rough ocean waves. The third showed the same shape beside twisted train tracks. Different artists, different countries, different decades. Yet the proportions felt uncomfortably close. The long arms, the unnatural height. The featureless face. None of the drawings were identical. In fact, they looked exactly like drawings made by different people remembering the same thing. The researcher stared at the sketches for several minutes without speaking. Then he pulled another archived file from the shelf. Inside, there was one more drawing. He placed it beside the others. It matched them. Not perfectly, but closely enough to make coincidence feel impossible. Over the following weeks, more archived interviews were reviewed. The pattern repeated itself. Not every sole survivor reported seeing the figure. Most never mentioned anything unusual. But every survivor who did described something remarkably similar. The file still offered no explanation. No name, no origin, no reason. Only the same impossible question. How could complete strangers, separated by decades, describe almost the same figure without ever knowing the others existed? The researcher spent months reviewing every archived interview he could legally access. He wasn't trying to prove the figure existed. He was trying to prove it didn't. He searched for copied statements, shared investigators, leaked reports, news articles. Anything that could explain why complete strangers remembered something so similar. He found nothing. No common location. No shared history. No connection between the survivors. The only thing they had in common was that they were the only people who lived. Eventually, the researcher created a separate folder containing every interview that mentioned the mysterious figure. It wasn't an official investigation. It wasn't recognized by any institution. It was simply a collection of statements that refused to fit anywhere else. The folder continued to grow. One new case every few years. Sometimes after a traffic accident. Sometimes after a building collapse. Sometimes after disasters that made international headlines. The details always changed. The figure never did.
Some survivors described it standing dozens of feet away.
Others remembered seeing it through smoke. Several insisted they only noticed it for a second. One survivor claimed the figure disappeared the moment rescue workers arrived. Another couldn't remember the accident itself, but remembered the figure perfectly. Despite all their differences, the sketches remained disturbingly consistent. Not identical, just similar enough that no one could comfortably dismiss them. Years later, the researcher was invited to speak privately with a group of trauma specialists. He brought copies of several interviews. He showed them the sketches. No one laughed. No one offered an explanation. Most simply assumed the similarities were another strange effect of extreme psychological stress. One specialist finally broke the silence. If this is trauma, it's the most consistent trauma response I've ever seen. No one in the room disagreed. The researcher never published his work, not because anyone stopped him, but because he couldn't reach a conclusion he was willing to defend. He couldn't claim the figure was real. He also couldn't explain why so many unrelated people remembered nearly the same thing. Without evidence, either conclusion would have been irresponsible. So the folder was sealed away with the rest of the archived interviews. Over time, most people forgot it existed. But every few years, another sole survivor is interviewed. Another routine psychological evaluation is completed. Another ordinary question is asked. What do you remember? Most answers never stand out. Then, every once in a while, someone hesitates, looks down, and quietly says they saw someone standing nearby, watching. The interview is documented. The statement is filed away. And unless someone decides to compare it with interviews from decades earlier, it becomes just another forgotten page inside another forgotten archive. Maybe that's all it is. A coincidence, a trick of the human mind. Or maybe, somewhere inside hundreds of unrelated case files, complete strangers have been describing the same silent figure for decades, and nobody noticed, because no one ever thought to place their drawings side by side.